that, viewers, the big story tonight is not one that is unexpected. Let me explain and let me hold forth for just a few moments. Viewers, each night on India Upfront, you are virtually accosted by an ecosystem that tells you that there's nothing going right under the Modi administration, that the last 9 years have been a study in mismanagement of the economy, the purveying of prejudice against minorities, and the insidious management of the headlines by pressuring the media to be pliable and subservient to the government's fakery. That's what you hear night after night. And most often, viewers, it is left to us to sift fact from fiction. And I, of course, try and bring out the fact, viewers. Whether I make an impression or not, I don't know. But the endeavor from my side is always to bring out the facts, the absolute facts, and nothing but the facts. Because facts have fans. Time and again, the facts also speak up. And they're so powerful that they dismantle this invidious Lutyens narrative that nothing is going right, that everything is falling to pieces. Today, viewers, is one such day. The National Statistical Office, the NSO, has put out India's GDP figures. The figures, it would be fair to say, have surprised the government itself. That's because growth is robust and more than predicted by the Reserve Bank of India itself. The data coming is sure to deflate the negativists, primarily because it not just confirms that the economy is accelerating, but also because despite growth retarding headwinds, India is likely to be the best performing economy next year too. There are, of course, viewers, as I told you, challenges awaited. The numbers by themselves will be dissected, and they should be, because that's the exercise. But viewers, at least they go to some extent in addressing those that make us feel bad about where we are. Now, viewers, some of the headline numbers I will bring to you in just a few moments. But the government has even met its fiscal deficit target. Inflation is off the boil also. And I want to put out a three-window that sums up my entire introduction tonight. There it is. Then let's keep this, only this, on air for a few moments. Because what does it tell you, viewers? What do these visuals tell you? On the one side, that India has beaten expectations, that the narrative that is being driven and forced down our throats by certain individuals is punctured, and that India is now the world's rock star. Add to this better than expected employment data in urban areas. There was a report just 2 days back, which I will go into some depth, and there's a fair bit to be cheery about. It's not all gloom and doom. Coincidentally, viewers, the numbers are out on a night when a report by Morgan Stanley has said, and I quote, India is different from what it was in 2013. In a short span of 10 years, India has gained position in the world order with significant positive consequences for the macro and market outlook, unquote. Morgan Stanley research puts the transformation down to 10 big changes that have been made over the last decade. More on that later. But for those interested in numbers, here's a quick glance of the macro data. Let's have a look at it. For the first time in 3 quarters, India's GDP grew to 6.1% in Jan-March. Latest quarterly growth numbers significantly higher than expectations. surge in growth in the last quarter of 2022-23 led by the manufacturing sector. For 22-23 as a whole, the GDP growth is pegged at 7.2%. Growth estimate 20 basis points higher than second advance estimate of 7%. The numbers will ease fears of the Indian economy slowing down. Of course, viewers, the caveat must be added that there are headwinds all across the globe. All economies will perhaps be hit. Some have gone into recession. Some of the principal economies in Europe have gone into recession. But despite that, because of where we are placed, we are in a better place, viewers, to resist these headwinds and still grow and still be the brightest spot on the horizon, on the economic horizon. And that's good news. And viewers, let me tell you that just the other day, Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman was alluding to the upturn in India's economic fortunes and the alertness of the government in anticipating headwinds. Listen in.
Beating United Kingdom and reaching the level of fifth largest economy. We were at the 11th position, and at the 5th position was UK. Today we've moved upwards and UK has fallen down. So it's a very big achievement for an emerging market economy. That story by itself is worth talking about, and we are still the fastest growing economy this year and for next year as well. इन्फ्लेशन का डेटा शायद आपके पास नहीं हो, मैं आपको स्पष्टीकरण देना चाहती हूं. ऑलरेडी वो 4.8 तक पहुंच रही है. होलसेल प्राइस इंडेक्स तो क्लोजर टू नेगेटिव टेरिटरी. इसीलिए हम निगरानी रखेंगे, आने वाले दिन में भी निगरानी रखेंगे. इन्फ्लेशन के ऊपर एकमात्र भी हमारी निगरानी कम नहीं हुआ.
Now, several economists have also hailed the numbers, the buoyancy in India's GDP figures. Let's listen in.
Now, this is much better than any expectation, and we should be happy that where most of the developed economies are reeling under the pressure and the fear of inflation looming large on them. Some of them have already slipped into, some European economy have already slipped into recession. India is turning out to be an oasis of growth. Obviously, the talk around the world is of India and India's growth. And this proves one more thing, that we are heading in the right direction.
It's very encouraging that our estimation is that we are going to have 7.2% plus GDP growth rate in this financial year. As far as the growth is concerned, it will be driven by the consumption because we have huge demand. There is no problem with the consumption. Supply side is also being maintained. So capital formation is also good. We have major role to play in this case, and that is the trade, hotel, transport, communication. So we have so many problems and difficulties in the geopolitical situations, but at least we are going very well.
GDP of 6.1% is very, very encouraging, considering the fact that the global economy is right now facing headwinds. We look at some of the most developed economies around the world. In this situation, I think if India posting numbers of 6.1 GDP is extremely encouraging. I think every citizen of the country should feel proud of the fact that they are part of an economy which is now world's fifth largest.
Well, India's GDP numbers have beaten expectations and predictions, cementing the country's status as a global bright spot. Here's what I mean, viewers, and let's look at the numbers. Growth pegged at 7.2% over the last year, 22-23. IMF's projection was 5.9%. So that's a big jump. RBI's projection was 7%. Even that's been found wanting. World Bank's projection was 6.3%. Viewers, Morgan Stanley research report has listed that at least 10 factors have influenced this transformation. It's a coincidence that this report was out today. They talk about supply-side policy reforms. And if you look at those, what is what on your screens? It's easy to look at, and let me tell you what we are looking at on your screens on the left-hand side. It may be a little difficult for you to pick up because the font is small, but we are talking about India's corporate tax, which is at par with peers. In fact, the number which is in red in the middle was a high corporate tax, and that was where we were in 2013. And now, of course, the number in the extreme right, which is in a box, is where we are currently. Also, viewers, infrastructure has picked up pace in the last 8 years. Look at the growth, the surge. So we are talking about an incremental rise in that number. If you look very closely, you see what I'm talking about. Digital transactions have also gone up. There on the right-hand side, you can see from such a low base, where 4.4% in FY 2016, today, 76% of GDP are digital transactions, which signals the formalization of the economy. GST collections have also been nudging upwards. Let's look at another number. Viewers, social transfers direct to beneficiary. Look at that number, how cash and kind, and I'm talking about a growth from 2013 to 2014, where DBT transfers, social transfers, are almost negligible. To look at the number now in 2022, 2023, in cash is the blue bar, and in kind is the buff-colored bar. And there are many such, viewers, many such macro indicators that we can put out there for you to read. Insolvency and bankruptcy code, complete change. There you can work out the corporate debt percentage of GDP to moderate to 50% in FY 2023. That's the estimate. And look at the number that's going down. And on the left, you can see the impaired loan ratio at 12-year low. This is the cleanup. Inflation. The finance minister is talking about inflation. Look at that box in the middle of your screens. Double-digit inflation back in 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And now, viewers, it's being tamed. It's still on the higher side for anyone's liking, but definitely showing a downward trend. The decoupling of Fed and RBI policy rate hike cycle, you can see again, viewers, they're looking very good for us. FDI, growth in FDI, there it is, zooming upwards. That's also happening. Viewers, as I told you, there are several such graphs. MNC sentiment is also at a multi-year high. This has not been the case for the last few years. So let's open this up, and let me bring in Dr. K.V. Subramanian, Executive Director of IMF and former CEA, Chief Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister of India. Now, thank you so much, Doctor, for speaking to us. We have,
my pleasure, Rahul.
We have a fair mix of extremely persuasive debaters tonight, also well informed. So you'll have to make an impression on them, and that will depend a lot on the numbers that you today put out there for the public. Now, viewers, we're not going to make this dull and boring and statistical, but I will tell you that numbers are important because those are the ones that are constantly subject to scrutiny, and there is a big question mark put around them constantly. And today, let the numbers speak, even at the expense of being slightly boring. Dr. Ranganathan will perhaps lighten proceedings by injecting his dose of sarcasm. But look, viewers, let me bring in Dr. K.V. Subramanian. K.V. Subramanian, I remember speaking to you a few years ago, just after COVID, and you said we are going to emerge very strong. Now, what has led this growth? This is very encouraging. This is some good news.
Thank you very much, Rahul, and a very good evening to viewers. I am glad you bring that conversation up, Rahul. During COVID, I think one of the key things that India did was to identify the nature of the crisis very well. Every economic crisis usually is a big shock to demand, but the COVID crisis was also a big shock to supply. And India was sagacious enough to identify this, in March, April of 2020. And, one of the first slides that Morgan Stanley talks about, which is the supply side policies, were implemented because we identified the nature of the crisis. If we look at many of the other economies, almost none of them failed to identify, none of them could identify correctly that this crisis is going to be a big supply side shock. You have to keep in mind, Rahul, that unlike demand, where you give money and the money reaches hands, very quickly, almost instantaneously in the case of India because of the click of a button, supply side measures take time to manifest. If we initiate those measures, let's say today, maybe a year and a half from the time they are initiated, they actually, get implemented, because infrastructure does not grow up, overnight. And that is another aspect that had to be kept in mind. So I think this goes back to very sagacious, policy responses. India having not only the self-confidence, but also the courage of conviction to know that it has identified the crisis correctly, and therefore it will basically chart its own sui generis course, not just mimic what other countries did. If you allow me, I will contrast this, Rahul, with what we got during the global financial crisis. Then by mimicking what the advanced economies did, the typical copy-paste that economics that we used to do, we had the situation of India becoming part of the fragile five with the macros, whether it was fiscal deficit, current account deficit, inflation, all of them at very highs, and macro fundamentals being really in trouble. Growth also slowed down because we only did demand side measures at that time. I think the contrast in the way the country has responded to these crises, I think shows the ability to identify, think through, and have the foresight to implement the right measures. So it's very heartening to be able to see. Last point, I would say, even this 7.2% number for this year will get revised upwards. If you look at the evidence that has come the last 2 years, the upward revisions have been to the extent of 1.1%. So I think even this number, I think this will settle down at north of 7.5%, for FY23.
Okay, that's also very encouraging to know. Dr. Mehrotra, now no one is here trying to suggest that we have overcome all obstacles. There are obstacles, but this is a bit of good news, caught us all by a bit of surprise. What do you put it down to? Would you still say that we're in the doldrums, that, the economy has been mismanaged, this, that, the other?
Well, let's look underneath the numbers, and despite the PLI, the performance-linked incentive scheme, manufacturing has grown only by 1.3% in FY23. The good news is relatively strong growth in construction at 10% compared to 14.8% last year. The other good news is, of course, agriculture has kept up. And finally, financial, real estate and professional services have grown at 7.1% as opposed to 4.7%. So I'm just breaking the numbers down for you. However, can we just take a slightly broader view of this? Because let's remember that for 3 years straight, before COVID broke, the economy had been systematically slowing down on account of policy mistakes. Secondly, while the economy has recovered from a very low base, by low base, I mean our economy contracted by 6.6% when the world economy during COVID contracted only by 3.1% in FY21. The actual average growth rate over the last 3 years, meaning FY21 to 23, is no more than 3%, which is below the rate that we were experiencing until COVID. Secondly, we were just told that India was among the fragile five. Let's just remind ourselves, despite a global economic crisis in 2008, and again a global slowdown post-2011, the 2004 to 14, the GDP growth rate was 8%.
So, what are you trying to say? I'm not understanding. Are you saying that it's still bad?
You're not understanding. let me complete.
We are going back into time. Let's talk about today. No one has said that, look, we are, let's talk about today. Where are we today? Have we done something right to get to 7.2%, or, we've just stumbled into this number?
Excuse me, if I might just clarify, obviously there has been a K-shaped recovery. We know that the organized sector is doing well, the unorganized sector is doing very poorly, which is the reason why manufacturing is not growing, which is the reason why jobs are not growing, which is the reason why real wages have been falling or actually stagnant.
Sir, in urban areas, we've just had numbers that seem to suggest there's been uptick in jobs.
Well, urban areas account for precisely 1/3 of the population and of the workforce.
What does it tell you? In fact, in major economies, if you really look at it, I agree with you that yes, agriculture forms a huge component and takes in a lot of people. But as you want to develop, you want to take more people off the farm and put them into factories or other
what has
areas.
Happened, precisely right. Precisely right. And you know what the number of people who've gone back to agriculture? The number of people who went back to agriculture in 2020 was 45 million, and an additional 8 million were added to agriculture.
Yeah, but obviously, because we were in a COVID situation, sir, there was a lockdown. Obviously, that would happen. It happened globally.
Have they begun to come out? No, they have not. That's the tragedy.
Sorry, sir, manufacturing
investment is not picking up.
Manufacturing
the economy is growing.
Okay, let me bring. Okay, let's fine. So, look, viewers, we're still, according to Dr. Mehrotra, this is jobless growth, frankly speaking, in ballpark terms. So nothing really changes while everything changes. Okay, let me get the former CA in as well as Sanju Verma into this conversation. Doctor, first response to Dr. Mehrotra, who says that jobless growth, that's basically net.
So first, let me put out some facts for our viewers. I think this idea of that this is coming from a low base is completely incorrect, because the GDP has already, had a recovery. Not just that, I had written a piece in the Times of India, looking at the 3-year GDP growth rate for all large economies. And, given our inflation, not just that, our, 3-year growth rate is highest among all the economies. So even taking into account, the decline due to COVID, we still are much higher. And accounting for inflation, we are a clear positive outlier. As for employment, and this is something commentators who want to always, habitually look at the negatives, always bring this up. And there's a lot of noise here. I want to clarify very clearly. If you look at the PLFS numbers, and these are formal numbers, actually annual PLFS includes both urban and rural areas. So it's not just for the urban areas as the quarterly PLFS is. If you look at those numbers, wage and salaried employees, and I'm talking about quality of employment, because this is the other thing that people bring up. Oh, quantity has gone up, quality has not. So I'm talking about wage and salaried employees. That went up by 15.1 million in 2019-20 vis-a-vis 2017-18. Formal employment went up by 12 million during that period. Not just that, even during COVID, the recovery in all the metrics that we look at, whether it is the worker population ratio, whether it is the unemployment rate, or the LFPR, labor force participation rate, all of those have registered V-shaped recovery. I must point out the recovery for females was a little lower slope, was slower than that for males, which we expect, given women being caregivers. But overall, if you look at, employment workers, female workers have actually increased by 40%, while male workers have increased by 8.6%. So I think when we look at the correct numbers, the national NSSO's numbers, it's very clear employment has grown well. Of course, it was impacted during COVID, as has happened in every country. That's right. ILO data shows that as well. Okay. So I think it's a little selective.
So what matters is how you emerge from COVID and how far ahead you might be of other large economies that are more comparable to you. Okay, Sanju Verma, I know it's your subject and you're itching to get in, and you can. I just wanted Dr. K.V. Subramanian to state his case because inevitably, even if you were to bring in those numbers, they would say, oh, you're a BJP spokesperson, so what else do you expect? So here we have somebody who works for the IMF, former CA, and he's given us some numbers. Now, viewers, you can disbelieve him. You can go with Dr. Mehrotra, no problems. Now, the political part of this conversation is going to begin. Sanju Verma.
Okay.
You've heard the opposition. Even right now, I have reactions from them to say that, look, these numbers, unfortunately, are, well, doctored.
You know, Rahul, there's a famous quote, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. So we leave the opposition to stew in their own juices. I think Dr. Subramanian has set the tone and tenor of the debate. I will address the elephant in the room. There are two big issues which the opposition rakes up on every single debate pertaining to the economy. One is inflation. The inflation average in the first 5 years of Modi 1.0 was about 4.67%. Of course, you had two black swan events, the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the COVID pandemic. And we saw inflation in India as elsewhere globally skyrocketing. Nobody is denying that. Nobody's trying to shove things under the carpet. But I think where the India story suddenly, goes haywire in terms of breaching analyst expectations and throwing more than just one or two surprises is the fact that despite two black swan events, despite global oil prices skyrocketing to as high as $137 a barrel last year, and given that we import more than 83% of our crude requirements, that indeed is something that was a huge headwind for us. Despite all that, I am so happy to tell you that the latest inflation number is 4.7% retail and wholesale is minus 0.92%. But for the common man, it's food inflation which matters. Food inflation, retail is 3.84%, wholesale is only 0.17%, potato and onion inflation is a negative 18% each. So food prices are coming down, and how? And the most important point being now that is India seeing a jobless growth? I would like to just add to what Dr. Subramanian said. You know, let us take the EPFO and ESIC data. I've studied the data and I've written for First Post on this a couple of days back. Let us take the data for the last 9 years of the Modi government. You will see that every month, 15.76 lakh new subscribers are being added on a net basis. Now, if you do just rough arithmetic, it basically means if you add the EPFO and ESIC data, taking an average of 15.76 lakh per month, you're basically saying that around 1.89 crore new subscribers have either been added or have gotten transferred from the informal to the formal sector, which means if you take an average of 1.89 crore per year, you're basically saying, and this is something which Ashwini Vaishnav mentioned a few days back, you're actually saying that in the last 9 years of the Modi government, 17.01 crore people either got new jobs or got into the formal sector from the informal sector and saw phenomenal wage growth. So this whole narrative about a jobless growth is a whole lot of gibberish and hogwash. And now very quickly, you know, the most important thing which Morgan Stanley mentioned, and I think, Rahul, nobody talks about this. It is point number 1, supply side policy reforms. And I would just like to say that there are 4 big supply side policy reforms which everyone should be aware of. 1, doing away with the retrospective taxation which was introduced in 2012 by Congress. We did away with that in 2021. No wonder in the last 9 years, foreign direct investment has been pouring in at $532 billion cumulative, which is the best that it has ever been. Second big supply side policy reform was introducing PLI in April 2020, covering 14 sectors. Total outlay $3 billion, will bring in close to 6 million jobs in the next 5 years and 30 lakh crore worth of investment. The third one, and I think this needs to be spoken of. You know, we had Jawaharlal Nehru who nationalized Air India, and it took us $1 billion plus every year to just keep it afloat in the last few years. when we decided to privatize Air India in 2022 January, it had a cumulative loss of more than 87,000 crore. And I'm so happy that apart from the privatization of Air India in Jan 2022, the other big positive and structural reform, mind you, is that we decided to open up the coal sector to the private sector. Coal, if you recall, Rahul, was nationalized by Indira Gandhi in 1973.
Okay.
And you will be happy to know that I just saw the profit numbers. 20 seconds more. I just saw the profit numbers of Coal India. Coal India has reported in the current financial year a profit of 28,000 crores plus. And yes, last but not the least, Rahul, 1 minute. We were, we inherited banking losses. 20 seconds. Banking losses from the Congress.
Yes.
Do you know that today the public sector banks have reported a net profit in financial year 2022-23 in excess of 1.05 lakh crores. SBI alone reporting a profit of more than 50,000 crores.
Okay, so you're talking up the policies and the impact of those policies. One gets it. Let me bring in Dr. Ranganathan and Sanjay Jha. Let me bring them in. They've been patient. Dr. Ranganathan, look, we're not saying that everything that has been touched has turned to gold. Obviously not. But there are numbers today which indicate that at least a few things that have been touched have turned to silver. There is a bit of glitter around. Would it be wrong to suggest this, Dr. Ranganathan?
Good evening, Rahul. Look, GST collections at a record high of 1.9 lakh crores. Manufacturing PMI at a 4-month high of 57. Exports surging 14%. Foreign reserves at an 11-month high. Car dispatches up 13%. Coal production up 9%. Retail inflation at an 18-month low of 4.7%. Tax filings at an all-time high. Sensex surging all-time high of 63,000. GDP surpassing all expectations at 7.2%. Terrible. Modi should resign. Ho kya raha hai is desh mein? No, Rahul, I speak as a layman. At a start, I must clarify, I know as much about the economy and economics as Dr. Mehrotra. But to be honest, no, sorry, I meant Sanjay Jha. The fact of the matter is, do I see the glass as half full or half empty? And here I must clarify that I see it today at least as half full. My seeing the glass as half empty would mean two things, that things could have been so much better had the Modi government continued with the reforms and had the courage to install the reforms that it did, but then buckled. I talk about the farm reforms, I talk about many other things. Privatization should have happened with breakneck speed. It hasn't. Only Air India is the only example. Disinvestment, yes, but then again, PSUs are buying PSUs. But over and above that, I think the fact of the matter is that, and by the way, can I also congratulate my good friend Dr. Subramaniam of having joined the IMF and not World Bank, because World Bank got the estimate wrong by 1%. Yeah. They said India is GDP is going to be 6.2%. So congratulations on that front. But it is Dr. Subramaniam's IMF that actually says that 83% of India's labor force, I think 550 million, are employed in the informal sector. So all the data that we have must come from formalization. Now, it is also nobody's grouse because SBI has come up very late. I don't know how trustworthy that thing, whether it is peer reviewed or not. They're saying that the informal sector has shifted, or the contribution to economy has shifted by or reduced by 20% in the last 8 or 9 years, which is a good thing.
It's a good thing.
But still, Dr. Subramaniam would have to explain. I urge him to explain that how do we reduce this 83 to 90% of our labor force employed in the informal sector, because until we do that, I'm sorry, India would always be a case of missed opportunity.
Yeah, of course, one step at a time. Let's first get into this debate about whether the doomsayers got it wrong. I think that's what we started out with, and I just want to draw your attention, viewers, to a tweet the Prime Minister has just tweeted. He's looking at these numbers himself, and he's tweeted, and he says, the growth figures underscore the resilience of the Indian economy amidst global challenges. This robust performance, along with overall optimism and compelling macroeconomic indicators, exemplify the promising trajectory of our economy and the tenacity of our people. Yes, viewers, and let me tell you, and what really hurts me is when top leaders go abroad and they talk about a divided India where only prejudices pervade in all corners and people are at each other's throats because there's a lack of trust. Now, viewers, an economy wouldn't be growing if there was sectarian strife constantly. And I want you to know, viewers, how hollow this is. This is an economy that is moving and taking along everybody, irrespective of their caste and their creed. And the reason I'm saying it is because the Economic Advisory Council has put out a working paper, and it says, and it's called A Secular Democracy in Practice. Now, there are several indicators. Our first set, it says, of results relates to households' access to electricity. Goes on to say, even though we observe significant gains across all the religious groups, the most considerable improvement in target achievement was for the poorest 20% of the Muslim households at 71%. It breaks it down. Bank accounts, regarding access to bank accounts, here again, the biggest gain was for Muslim community with a target achievement of approximately 77%. For different social groups, the target achievement was highest among the OBCs at 75% and above 70% for the ST and STs. Access to mobile phones. Here again, viewers, among the Christians, Muslims and Hindus, the poorest 20% of the households had a target achievement of more than 30%. It goes on. For the religious clusters, the highest target achievement was in Muslim and the Hindu and Muslim clusters at 37 and 33%. Access to toilet. And it just gives you water on premises. Let's talk about water, viewers. This increased marginally for both communities by 2019-21. For Muslims, it increased by 5%, while for Hindus, it increased by 11%. We also noted that 2015-16, 63% of the poorest 20% of households in the Muslim community had access to water on premises, while for Hindus, it was 41% in 2015-16. This increased marginally. So you have a lot of these indicators, viewers, which says that this growth is inclusive, which is really what matters, Sanjay Jha, because your boss keeps going all over the world and he talks about the breakdown of social structures in this country.
Rahul, it's 8:32. You've had 3 people on your panel who have been actually backing and celebrating the government data. Dr. Mehrotra has barely spoken. So in the interest of a fair and impartial debate on India upfront, and I will take less time than the BJP spokesperson, please do not interrupt me at all when I now read to you some data shorn of any rhetoric. Let me start. Number 1, labor force participation rate that tells you the number of people looking for jobs is at an abysmal 39%. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, is forced to do an event, a PR drama by distributing 72,000 appointment letters, which is basically taxpayers' money, to tell that there are jobs. The number of jobs that the BJP promised India by now was 180 million. India has job growth, and that is a fact that cannot be contradicted by using rhetoric. Point number 2, Manrega demand is rising. And that's a point that Dr. Mehrotra rightly made. Post-pandemic, people are still not able to get back to their jobs. They need Manrega demand. And that tells you that rural economy is bleeding. Ask the FMCG companies, they'll give you the answer. Point number 3, private consumption. Look at the sale of entry-level two-wheelers, motorcycles, cars. They're not rising at all. They're pre-pandemic level. The SUVs and maybe the Jaguars and Mercedes are, which establishes the point that we all make, that this is a government of Marie Antoinette, where basically if you can't eat bread, it's cakes. Can you imagine the finance minister of this country celebrating India's size of the economy, which happens to historical evolution? What she doesn't tell you, this is the finance minister of this country. What she doesn't tell the people of India is that we are ranked 144 on the per capita income. And without redistribution and ensuring equitable growth.
Don't torture data.
One second, let him finish. Let him finish, he didn't interrupt.
Please, I didn't interrupt anybody. I need some decency on your program today, Rahul. I'm making statistical points. There is no drama and hyperbole. Point number 4, very critical, okay? Why have 16 lakh people from India, including dollar millionaires, left the country and gone abroad since Mr. Modi ji became Prime Minister. If your economy is booming, people come in. They don't leave you. They don't search. A very important index of actual growth of a country is not actually the GDP at all. It is actually called the Human Development Index. You will find the word human is rarely used by the BJP and its cheerleaders, including some of them who
I want to come in, please.
I don't want to be interrupted, Rahul. This is not fair at all. I'm wrapping up. Okay, including the point that the Human Development Index is not a relevant issue for this government at all. It's zero. Let's not even get into that. And a point on investment. Do you know that in the last 2 years alone, projects worth 29 lakh crore have been scrapped? They are no longer there. And these were the same ones that Mr. Modi ji and the team were celebrating on tweet. My other point, they talk about FDI. You know what they don't tell you is that FDI rises. Of course they do, ladies and gentlemen. But FDI, when you look at it as a percentage of the GDP, is actually not 42%. What are they talking about? And one
Rahul,
other
important idea. He's lying.
Look at the way they lie to farmers, Rahul. Doubling of farm income by 2022. क्या हुआ? जब वो किसान से आप जब जवानों से झूठ बोलते हो तो यार आज
ठीक है.
जाएगा.
So you've quoted a huge number of statistics.
It is an Adani-driven economy.
Okay, it's an Adani-driven economy that the Congress also leverages in. The Congress leverages also in Rajasthan. Without that Adani, thousands of crores that you welcomed. It's okay. Sanjay Jha, look, that's where you do yourself a disservice when you make points which you can't substantiate. Adani-driven. Viewers, the Rajasthan government is worshipping Adani. Gehlot says, I have no problem with the man. He's on record.
So that's why Mr. Modi ji is scared to bring the JPC.
No, I need to make a few quick
I don't understand where this is going. The JPC has been objected to by Sharad Pawar, your own ally. He said JPC is a waste of time. He's given Adani a clean chit.
Rahul,
one second. No, let's not get into rhetoric because it's just facile.
Since Narendra Modi
It becomes facile, Sanjay Jha, when you start talking about, your own allies, the left, that you hang on to their coattails in Bengal. In Kerala, I welcomed Adani asking him to make a port. Come on, let's get, and the TMC government, the chief minister there stands in the investor summit with Adani and says, please invest in my state. So you can't, and the family, the Gandhi family that gave Mr. Adani, and he's very proudly saying this.
Really?
His start
His
in life.
wealth grew in the last 3 years.
Anyhow,
Mr.
one
Modi
second.
as the Prime Minister.
Okay, look, again, there you go.
He grew by
Viewers,
85%.
before 2019, it was the Ambanis, and before 2023, it will be the Adanis, and that's how it goes. We forget that the Ambanis were around when the Congress was around. We forget. Anyhow, I'm not going down that route. Very quick, 20 seconds to you, Sanju Verma. I have another big story to go to, the Gyanvapi story, so I can't just sit here and we'll have, one bunch of statistics bandied about. So just quickly go with what.
Please give me 45 seconds.
Yeah,
please.
take 45 seconds, no more. Yes.
Okay. First and foremost, I completely debunk Sanjay Jha's data of 39% labor participation rate. There is a note by the PIB dated January 2023. The latest labor participation rate is 57.5%. Currently, prior year was 55.6%. Sanjay Jha's 39% is wrong. Second point, FDI as a percentage of GDP was 1.8% under the Congress. It is 3.92% currently under the Modi government. And the last and the most important point.
Lies.
Please note, and I'll quickly
lies.
finish. Rahul,
Let him finish. Let her finish. Let her finish.
the
Yes.
world's sixth largest stock market in terms of market capitalization, India. The world's second largest steel manufacturing capacity, India. The world's fourth largest automobile manufacturer, India. The world's second largest two-wheeler manufacturer, India. The world's largest financial inclusion scheme, Jan Dhan Yojana, thanks to Modi. The world's largest health insurance scheme, Ayushman Bharat, thanks to Modi. The world's largest self-employment generating scheme, Mudra Yojana, thanks to Modi. We have today more than 78,000 startups, Sanjay Jha. Under your Congress, there were less than 2,000 startups. Today we have 115 unicorns.
Okay, the economy has grown, viewers. The question is whether it has grown equitably. that, as I said, is a project that is ongoing. No one has the magic wand. We've had 2 black swan events. One came in from nowhere, perhaps ill-advised. Some people would say intentions were right, but perhaps didn't take into account the fallout. The second one,
5 seconds.
viewers, came from nowhere. It was COVID, and we've all suffered, but we've all bounced back.
5 seconds,
Yes,
Rahul.
Dr. Ranganathan, 5 seconds, and I need to move on, please. Yeah.
For a change, I agree with Dr. Sanjay Jha, because talking about GDP is useless, because India remains very low on the happiness index, as well as on the democracy index, as well as on the press freedom index.
Yeah. Wonderful.
And Sri Lanka was ranked very high on the happiness index and went almost bankrupt.
You know,
We
let
had
me
to
tell you,
virtually bail out Sri Lanka.
Today, on the
Sanjay
press
Jha,
freedom index,
we had to bail
Afghanistan,
out Sri Lanka.
Afghanistan is ahead of us. That tells you something. So don't go by these indexes. Let's just go, viewers, by some of these statistics that have been presented. And look, there is always a statistic to defeat another statistic, but let's at least today bask in a little bit of good news. We can go back to digging,
Good news for a few.
to singing dirges. Well,
Sanjay
sir,
Jha
I
is
mean, the
sulking
economy
today.
is
This is a
growing.
government of the
A large
have-your.
number of
Sanjay Jha
people
is
are...
crying.
This is the government of the
Sanjay Jha
have-your.
is whining.
Okay, that's a
After
political
seeing the
statement
7.1
out there.
have
Both,
numbers
okay,
and
I need to move on.
Both these governments
Viewers,
have it.
big news coming from the courts, from the High Court.